II, the first highly mechanized war, also varied from previous wars in that African Americans fought on the front lines alongside their fellow countrymen. This is not to say the battle against prejudice had been won, for the U.S. military was still deeply segregated. Of the 16.1 million Americans who served in World War II, only 8.7% of these troops were African American. For many African Americans, whom eagerly enlisted at the start of the war, frontline battle was a figment of fiction that they merely heard stories of. Of those who did engage in combat, nearly all were trained at an academy in Tuskegee, Alabama. The men soon became known as the Tuskegee Airmen and established the first all-African American flying unit, known as the 99th Pursuit Squadron, which preceded others. However, it wasn't until 1944 that these men saw face-to-face combat, engaged alongside their fellow countrymen. It was in Belgium, at the Battle of the Bulge, when General Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced with Hitler's last desperate offense, called upon 2,000 African American soldiers.
During the years of the war, discrimination and segregation at home spilled into the military. White men were most often chosen over African Americans in the draft. Despite the 1937 and 1940 mobilization plans that called for a balanced force of 10% blacks, this was never reached. The War Department set up obstacles to prevent many African Americans from enlisting, such as a literacy test. The Army used the Army General Classification Test and the Mechanical Aptitude Test to measure intelligence and aptitude of the recruits and evaluate where to place them in the military. Low scores often came from African Americans due to the environment they were forced into and raised in. Due to segregation and discrimination, they were often forced into ghettos, and lack of access to education also contributed to this. Though blacks and whites who came from similar economic backgrounds scored similarly, blacks were still treated differently, often given lower jobs within the military. White illiterates were also recruited to increase the number of whites, and whites with physical deficiencies were drafted 20% of the time, while blacks were not. As the war progressed, there was a growing need for more troops due to losses. The military was forced to place African Americans into positions of all ranks, however, they were not all met with respect.
As a civil rights believer, A. Philip Randolph wanted African American workers to demand for equality in the workforce. Because of Randolph's threat to Roosevelt, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 that prohibited discrimination in defense jobs as well as government. Later, after the war, Truman issued the Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the Army and civilian government. The order established the fair employment practices to enforce this new policy. As positions opened when the soldiers left to fight, the U.S. government needed to fill the factory positions and keep the economy going.
African Americans became more active in asserting their rights for fair treatment. The Pittsburgh Courier, the nation's largest black newspaper, initiated the WWII campaign, which stood for Victory Against Fascism Abroad and Victory Against Racism at Home. African Americans benefited economically from the labor shortage, which accelerated the entry of blacks into production industries and helped to reduce black poverty. African Americans still battled with discrimination, often in the form of violence. Detroit was the nation's most important production center during World War II, but was also a stronghold of the KKK. White communities guarded the dividing lines imposed by segregation. The 200,000 black citizens were forced into a tiny and unsanitary ghetto, ironically named Paradise Valley. Violence in the form of race riots erupted in the city.
In June 1943, America was faced with one of the worst race riots in Detroit. There was a huge migration of Southern blacks going to Detroit during World War II, and black housing was desperately needed. There was only one black housing project in the city called the Brewster Project, but it was already full. Detroit Mayor Edward Jeffries was aware of the problem and decided to make a new housing project called the Sojourner Truth. But on moving day, many whites intervened, and it was too much for the Detroit police to handle. African American families decided to move back, and the moving date was postponed. A protest occurred at the Packyard Motor Company. White protested that they didn't want to work side by side with the blacks and decided to walk out. 25,000 whites walked off the job. This event brought the production to a halt. The actual Detroit rioting of 1943 only lasted for 24 hours. A fight broke out between a black man and a white man at an amusement park and the Detroit River. The brawl eventually drew in other blacks and whites and soon spilled into the city. The riot was 2 miles in and around Paradise Alley, one of the most poorest areas in Detroit. The violence soon escalated. The riot ended when Roosevelt, with the request of Major Edward Jeffries, ordered 6,000
federal troops into the city.